The Borderlands franchise is a series of action role-playing first-person shooter looter games created by Gearbox, set in a western sci-fi fantasy world. The series holds the title of being the precursor of looter shooters. The franchise is very characteristic for its engaging co-op gameplay, story, world, and unique cel-shading visual style. Borderlands from its very beginning have been a tale about greed, wanting adventure, fame, glory, and setting foot in a cruel and violent world in search of something more. Despite our main characters always being categorized as the quote-unquote heroes, the idea that maybe they're not has always been planted since the very beginning. It is easy to step in someone's shoes and follow their goal because we are following along, and it is easier to justify it. Borderlands is also a franchise that is very characteristic for its humor and pop culture reference.
Don't toss the baby, just hold it over the mixer and make it cry.
Sometimes you'll try to make people laugh by using a meme from the EchoNet, but instead they'll track you down and set fire to your house. Look forward to that.
Whoop, time out. I gotta take this. This Tina.
It's Mr. Tor! Tina! Put me in the game!
Okay, the gatekeeper is now Mr. Tor.
Woo! Raphael, to see you! Wow!
And for its iconic villain, Handsome Jack. But I have always wanted to talk about how this franchise sells you this promise of being a badass, being invincible, and being a hero. Disclaimer, spoilers ahead for Borderlands the pre-sequel, Borderlands 2, Borderlands 3, and Borderlands 1. I'm not one to talk about morale objectively, this is merely an analysis of the franchise itself, simple social concepts of right and wrong according to what we consider quote-unquote normal as a society and its connection to the franchise. Starting with morality, there are a handful of villains in this world like Commandant Steel, Handsome Jack, Troy and Tyrene, as well as many corporations like Hyperion, Atlas and Maliwan, and our main protagonists in every game are expected to be the heroes, standing up against evil, helping people around and fighting, but it is not based entirely on moral motivators. When we choose to help someone out, we are always getting rewarded for doing so. When we as Bolt Hunters face a challenge, we face it because they are in the way of our goal, or because we are getting paid to do so, or because we're just getting loot. Always. All of the Bolt Hunters came to Pandora not only to find the vaults but also for personal reasons, as well as seeking glory and adventure, even the first one ever. Some have nobler goals like finding more about who they are, and others are more ruthless or even careless like escaping crime and shame. But what unites them all is a universal sense of accomplishment, power and glory manifested as the bolts. As seen in the story of the second game, Hyperion knows that people who come looking for the bolt are greedy. They want the treasures of the bolt, so what do? They just put up a radio spot.
Are you hungry for excitement, fame, eternal glory?
Wait a minute, turn that up.
The Hyperion Corporation needs your help to search for the lost alien vaults of Pandora. See the world, fight dangerous creatures, get rich beyond your wildest dreams. Become a Vault Hunter today.
And that's it. That's all it took to lure them in. People a lot of the time just need a motivator or a simple reason, and one can argue greed is what ties them all together. In the pre-sequel, we play as mercenaries for hire trying to help out a less evil Jack, previous to his psychopathic transformation. If we exclude Athena, who has been through a lot and at least has somewhat of a moral code, and Timothy and Claptrap, who essentially had no choice, the rest are some of the most despicable Vault Hunters out there, as we learn in the events of Borderlands 2, 3, and Tales of the Borderlands respectively. In all of the entries, I'd argue we play as morally grey characters simply united by a mutual goal. Even some of the Vault Hunters end up changing into the villains in the future. I think Pandora in general is a grey hunting ground. The planet is the remains of a multi-company war and countless people are victims of someone else's greed. The games shine a light onto the idea that the end justifies the means. The idea that Vault Hunters are nothing more than glorified bandits, only with a vague moral compass or philosophy, and it is something we can contemplate. Who survives if not the strongest and greediest? The best villains are the ones we can empathize with, and Borderlands always tries to do this, and it is intentionally presented as having similar goals to the protagonist, only with different methods or ideas. Of course, I am talking about Handsome Jack. Moving on to the idea of immortality, one thing that video games do, and especially Borderlands, is to sell you this feeling that the character is somehow immortal. This is achieved by utilizing the gameplay, and for example, Doom was one of the first video games to do this. When we shredded through enemies and intense and big bosses, and with ridiculously insane damage builds in the game, they enforce this concept well, and due to this, it forms a vicious cycle, a sense of superiority and immortality. In the first game, we are presented with strong characters, Lilith, Brick, Mordecai, and Roland, who defeat a giant alien monster and a military corporation, but they were all defeated by Wilhelm, and Brick and Mordecai couldn't even get through Hero's Pass during the battle against Jack. Roland was killed, and Lilith was captured by Jack himself. This falls in contrast with the fact that Lilith is presented in the stories as a very strong siren, and the strongest probably for a while. Athena was captured by Brick and Mordecai, Nisha was killed in a very forgettable way after a series of side missions, and Wilhelm during the events of Borderlands 2. And if we take into account the Vault Hunters from Borderlands 2, they were probably the strongest. They beat Handsome Jack and the Hyperion Corporation. Previous Vault Hunters outclassed our first set of characters, completely mastered Pandora, and opened multiple vaults. And essentially their strength seemed to have no limits until Borderlands 3. Amara, Zane, Flag, and Mose have proved to be even stronger than their predecessor, and they even take their abilities to other planets. Maya was killed during the events of Borderlands 3, rest in peace my favorite character. Zero wasn't needed with the fight against the Calypsos, and Lilith was defeated once again early on by Tyrene. This was sad for me because we grow attached to a group of characters. Once a set of hunters become these godlike figures, they go down the ladder as once again they are outclassed by a newer generation, and we sometimes forget that because of gameplay. And I can't help but to think that all of a sudden generations of Vault Hunters are reduced to nothing. They're no longer the legendary Vault Hunters and warriors we picture them as, because someone bigger always comes on top, someone greedier. I've considered the fact that this is inevitable, but it never ceases to be relevant in my opinion. Besides, there is a romantic aspect to the idea that one can become a legend and outclass someone else, that one can achieve a certain status or a title as well as a huge amount of loot. If we track it back to the gameplay, one's sense of power and completion can be reflected in our gear and perks, as well as our achievements that show we have defeated a hard boss or a hard mission. And think about it, even the name Vault Hunter has become a synonym with being strong. So that is the way I believe the franchise utilizes these elements to transmit this feeling of power to the players, and how this feeling and this aspect of the story must be shattered in order to progress the series. And going back a little bit to the concept of being a hero, the now iconic song of Borderlands 2, Shortchange Hero, highlights this idea that maybe we are not the heroes of our story. And even in the first title, the song No Rest for the Wicked, highlights the idea of a grey morality. The lead singer Matt was inspired by an old coworker that used to be a drug dealer. And finally, one of the other times that the games insist on this concept that maybe the Vault Hunters are not necessarily heroes is when Handsome Jack directly challenges the player. I think it challenges the player's moral compass.
I've told myself exactly the same thing. Everyone thinks they're the hero of their own story.
And even the pre-sequel and Tales toyed with that concept a little bit. For a time I thought that this may have been a stretch, but honestly I don't think it is.
Wow, I'm already impressed.
This is a franchise that I grew up with, and over the years these concepts have always stuck with me, and they have always been present on replay playthroughs, but I could never properly find the words to describe them until now. We can set a certain type of bond to the gameplay and the characters, and it happened with Maya, and it happened last year with Amara, and I have always loved the siren sisterhood dynamic that the games have shown us. Borderlands 3 reinforces this idea when playing through the main story, and I think it's a concept that took them a while to properly start portraying. One of the ways the franchise suffers in a narrative way is when players lose control of their characters and certain events of the story simply happen and we are powerless to do something. To be quite frank, I don't know how to phrase a conclusion to this, so I won't. My goal was to simply put on the table this concept of power and immortality that the series presented that ultimately strike the player in the face whenever a new story is presented, and how the games evoke these feelings through gameplay. And I think it's something that many players can probably overlook because of the gameplay or the humor, and it is something that has always been present to me. This is a fact that I never skip on talking about, but Borderlands is also a franchise that does representation incredibly well, so every time I get the chance to mention this, I do. Since the first game, it has never been sensationalized, it has always been treated as normal, it's inclusive, and it has great LGBTQI+ and even racial representation, and very few games do this well, and probably as early as they started doing it, and this was a comfort for me growing up. I stated in previous iterations of the script that maybe this was pointless, but I don't think it is now, because of the bonding aspects players have with the franchise, which is clearly very loyal. During my transition, playing Borderlands kind of helped me. This sense of feeling like a hero and having a sense of power was present for me. It's a franchise that always makes me feel capable, and like I previously argued, that helps one feel a sense of power, and that infectious feeling can translate into real life, not only a sense of power or motivation, but also of encouragement. Playing as Amara during my process felt comforting in a way. The thought of, if you put enough effort you can beat this boss in game, turns into, if you put enough effort into other things IRL, you may even succeed. I have questioned if this is odd or childish, but I do not believe it is. There are emotions involved in these games. When things were bad and I felt powerless, I always knew I could play Borderlands again and regain a sense of control or power. I felt somehow at home. At any rate, I hope this concept seemed interesting to you. It is not something I see often online, so I hope it sparks like a discussion or a line of thought, if you will. And if you're a fan of the franchise or have thoughts on the topic, I would love to hear what you have to say in the comments down below. Feel free to check my Patreon if you feel like supporting me. Write me on Twitter. Stay warm and stay safe. Thank you for watching.